Mino Line Media presents the Business First Podcast.
Hi, all, and welcome to a new episode of Business First with Sonia Aline. I am your host, and today we welcome back a guest. His name is Ted Santos. He is founder and CEO of Turnaround Investment Partners. He is known as the CEO Whisperer. And the last time he was here, we had a very spirited discussion about his latest book, Here's Why You Can't Find Love. Today, he's here to really focus on what's going on in our business environment, what are some of the problems, and how, as a business person, we can take advantage of the current situation. Welcome back, Ted. How are you?
Thanks for having me back. It's always a pleasure to have a conversation with you. I love the questions you ask, and I'm looking forward to this one.
Same here. You have provided a lot of insightful information. I watch your videos on your channel on YouTube. I would encourage our listeners to do that as well. And so today, when you wanted to come on and talk about some of the things that were going on in this current environment, how people should be looking at it, and how we can take advantage of what's actually going on. Although, as we know, many people are panicked with the election coming up, with the economy as it is. People are kind of panicked about what's going on in this environment. But you have always a very unique idea or perspectives on what's going on and how we can approach it in successful ways. So how would you like us to start this conversation today?
So first, I'll tell you the good news is the pandemic. I'm saying the pandemic has created a new economic paradigm, and we are benefiting, and so are corporations. But I'd first like to, if you don't mind, talk about the problems that businesses are facing and how perhaps the pandemic may have erased that, perhaps if people are aware of what's going on. And the problem is something that's existed at least as long as I've been alive. And we operate as though this is just the way it is and there's nothing we can do about it. There's something, and I forget who created it, it's called the problem solutions mass. And it's where if you were to create a circle and put a P in the middle of the circle, and that's your problem. And then you put a circle around that and say, this is the solution to that problem. And that solution creates another problem for which you have to create another solution for which creates another problem. And that just kind of keeps going on and on. Einstein said something like, we can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking that created them. And I'm saying that corporate America has created a problem, and they are not sure how to get out of it with the existing paradigm that we have.
Does corporate America, since their whole existence is about solving problems, do they know about this particular one? Or is this one that they're kind of operating in blindly?
I can comfortably say they're operating blindly, because I've been having this conversation for easily 20 years now. And when I took it to people who were CFOs, they would say that's mathematically impossible to do what you're saying. So I have a pretty strong roster of CEOs I know, including former CEOs of Fortune 500. So I called one, and this guy is known for doing an extraordinary job with the company he ran. His name really is Bob. So I called Bob and said, hey, Bob, I want to have a conversation with you. And, because of the position you've achieved in life, you're a guy who comes up with solutions. I said, today I want to have this conversation, and you can't just jump to an automatic solution yet. We're going to have to peel this conversation down in layers. And so I asked him, I said, corporations have a problem. They're not acknowledging it. The way it goes is, in good times, you hire people. In bad times, you fire people. And no one has looked under a rock for a third or fourth solution or way to handle it. We just go, good times, hire. Bad times, just fire. And he said, well, Ted, the reason there's no solution is because no one has paid anyone, a group of people, to sit in a room and told them you can't come out the room until you come up with a solution. So he said, when I ran, my company, the company I ran, he said, when bad times came, I just had people randomly laid off, thousands of them. And I made a joke and I said, so you went into a big room where there were a bunch of desks and said, everyone on the right side, you're fired, go home. And he said, no, I didn't do that. But he said, kind of, because, my people under me, I said, hey, man, this is, you have to get rid of 5,000 people. I don't care who you get rid of, but so randomly you have to cut heads. So what I said to him is, when we do that, I said, if General Motors lays off 10,000 people, that's 10,000 less people to buy homes. So then the home builders have to lay off people, and the washer and dryer companies have to lay off people because they're not putting in as many in houses. And then you can think of other things, that people are not getting lawn care. And so then now the GM has to lay off another 5,000. And so then everyone else lays off more and more people, and the whole economy goes into a downward spiral. So while on one hand we think, yay, we laid off people and we're making money, but the whole economy is now crashing, and companies are there. There's another problem. I don't remember if we got into this the last time, but corporations are losing 300 billion, that's billion, $300 billion every year in workplace productivity because of divorce or bad relationships. So
yes,
you lay people off, now people are, one spouse is laid off and now we're struggling financially. The whole company, people are hiding behind their desk because they don't want to be the next one to get, chopped from the company.
Right.
So morale drops. And this, now you have a low performing company. And I asked Bob, the CEO, I said, so why haven't we created a paradigm where your employees are so valuable that it actually costs more to lay them off than to keep them? So it's better to keep them to lay them off. And so then we just started, peeling this conversation. One of the unfortunate things that he said, and I had never considered, he said, Ted, if I lay off 10,000 people, at some point I have to replace 80% of those jobs. So that's a huge problem. You just laid off 10,000, you have to replace 8,000 jobs. And that means you have to pay to run ads. You have to pay people to interview, which stops them from doing other productive things.
Right.
You have to train all those people. The people who had great relationships with clients are now not there, so you have the possibility of mistakes. Some people are going to leave, and now you have to advertise for the job. So what I said to him, I said, so hypothetically, you save $10 million laying off those people, and it cost you $30 million to now replace the jobs. And you just, technically, you did a poor job. I mean, looking on the long term, so what does a corporation do? They financially,
Corporations have been doing this
right, but
year over year after
exactly
year over year.
right. So you're technically making poor decisions and thinking that I saved money, but really I spent more money to save that amount of money, and they created other problems. So now I buy back shares to make my price to earnings ratio look better than it really is. So people buy my stock. I do financial reengineering. I restructure. I do all these things to hide the fact that I spent 30 million to save 10 million. And those are hypothetical numbers. So
Right.
so this is a problem.
But isn't it's because it's been happening for so long, right? If a company is doing well, right, it makes sense that you can bring on more people, or that you can maintain the people that you have. And if a company is doing poorly, they have to figure out a way to reduce expenses. And so are you saying that there may be other ways to reduce expenses that companies aren't looking at, that we always think that it's human capital that has to be released?
So the other question I asked him was, and this is where CFOs say it's mathematically impossible. I say you put your employees, instead of looking at employees as a liability, you look at them as an asset. And the easiest, I think, example to give is if you look at a Navy SEAL. The Navy invests $2 million into each Navy SEAL. That's a lot of money. And what do they call those people, those Navy SEALs? Assets. We have an asset in France. We have an asset in, they're assets. And the last thing you want to do after putting $2 million into someone is to lose them. So, and if you lose a Navy SEAL who's worked for you for 5 years, it's not just the $2 million, it's the knowledge he's acquired over those 5 or 10 years. You don't want to lose that. And now having to replace that person is you're going to have to spend $2 million on a new Navy SEAL, and now you need time for him to catch up to where the other person was, right? So we just look at human capital as expendable. And I think Navy SEALs or special forces in the military, the way they manage that. So if you look at real estate, if I'm a corporation and I spend $1 million on a building, well, that's an asset. And if I want to increase the value of that building, that asset, there are things that I can do to make that building more valuable. So if you could put a number on an employee and then say, how do I increase the value of this human capital, as opposed to just laying them off and saying they're just a liability and an expense? And so one of the ways that I was able to get a CFO to see this is if you take your top 10 leaders in a corporation, and let's say it's a midsize, and each of those 10 is they're responsible for $10 million of money that comes in. So there's $100 million each, $10 million each. So what investments could you make in each of those people such that over the next 12 months, they're now worth $20 million? So it's very intentional. So what's kind of training? So you can train people just to have more product knowledge and know about technology. But if you look at a Navy SEAL, the way they are trained, that's a mindset. And so what they're able to talk about resilience, and you send them on a mission and things just go haywire and they change. They are actually trained to be able to navigate the chaos that comes and accomplish the mission without getting thrown off. That's why they're such a valuable asset. And you invest money so that they are competent in the face of chaos. And it's not even just a matter of resilience. It's people being powerful in the face of chaos and problems, disruption, as opposed to saying, "Oh, I don't deal with problems, man. Not my job description."
Well, wouldn't you say that it seems as if most companies will tell you, and they definitely talk about this in terms of their diversity practices. HR is always talking about how valuable people are to an institution.
Yeah,
But
do.
what we're saying is that that's all just talk at the end of the day, because if they really did value their employees, they would see that it may be worth it to keep, even though we're going through this process, and you've done videos on how chaos is always an opportunity for a company to emerge in a different way, to use the talent that you have to be able to navigate whatever this problem is, because we also know that the economic times swing, right? So we're in a bad time right now, but we could use the talent that we have to get us through to the other side. But corporations aren't seeing it that way.
So what the pandemic has forced us to do is to make that strategy of just laying off a bunch of people obsolete. So think about the pandemic. People were being paid to stay home, or
Right.
people were afraid to go to work. So corporations had to work harder than ever to get one employee. And when they finally did get that employee, when the Federal Reserve started raising interest rates, what do? The cost of capital is higher, so you just lay people off because you can't afford to keep all the same payroll because you're paying more to have capital to run your business. So instead of laying them off, the pandemic has forced them to do what I'm saying. They kept their people. See, since the Fed increased interest rates, we should have been in a recession. Everyone should have just laid off thousands of people, and GM, the home builders, the washers and dryers, everyone, and the ones that would have benefited were alcohol and tobacco companies. They would have benefited from the layoffs. Right. So the pandemic made that a poor strategy because you put so much effort to get one person that if you lay them off, oh my God, what if it's going to take the same amount of time? So we'll suck it up and keep them. So we're doing it.
The other thing we learned from the pandemic too was even though people were at home, we worked harder than ever. So corporations were very productive.
Maybe,
Well, I
maybe.
mean, the reports were for a lot of corporations that productivity was good.
Maybe initially, but I don't think that it's.
You don't think that has been
No,
maintained?
no, no. People are doing Zoom calls in a nail salon. I mean, come on, they're
Yeah. Well, we were doing Zoom calls everywhere, but I think that was also part of the realization, right? Like the thought was if you were at home, right, you weren't going to work. And what we found is that people were at home and they were working, right? They
yeah,
they may have been doing their Zooms in between, laundry and schoolwork and
exactly.
everything else, but they were still doing it.
So you could say we were in a sort of a state of emergency. So people
Right.
tend to put in a little bit of more effort, but sustaining that has been the challenge.
Right.
People
I
generally
agree.
tend to say, "I can't. I'm burned out," and I knew eventually they were going to say, "Come back to the office," because even if you look at the school system, the children that went back to school early have significantly outperformed the children that stayed home significantly. And so what they're finding now, and even the Generation Z is begging to go into the office because they're understanding the dynamics of interacting with other people and brainstorming and innovation. Those things that if everyone's working from home, you're going to have a void in that spontaneous conversation of let's go get coffee or just walking by your office had a thought. You miss out on that. Yahoo figured that out. So I was surprised that people thought this was going to go on forever. I was like, no way,
But
can't
you
happen.
also have those who are interested in going back into the office, but you also have those who are quite comfortable working or at least doing hybrid that aren't
Yeah,
really
okay.
really don't want to give up that work life balance if that's a real thing.
Well, one of the things that has happened is the corporations have been able to. They have some technology where they know your keystrokes, and they're seeing
Right.
that people are not working. It's just. I'm not saying that's everyone, but it's too many people that are
Right.
saying I worked 5 days for 10 hours a day, and they look at your keystrokes and they're like, "No, you're fired." That literally has happened. So I just I hear it, but I just don't buy it. So the possibility that's there, as opposed to just laying people off, American Express is a great corporation, a great example. Do you know
Okay.
they started in 1850? Do you know what they started doing when American Express started in 1850? I know I like to ask you questions and you may not have the answer, but here we go again. So
Yeah, I don't. I'm quite familiar with American Express, but I don't know what they started out doing in 1850.
1850, Pony Express. We're going to take your money, your gold from New York to Boston.
Okay. All
Then
right.
New York to DC, and DC to Boston, and then Atlanta, and then the whole country. And they were it. American Express. They took your money, and that's what they started doing in 1850. I think it was 1861. They were disrupted, and their revenue was cut in half almost overnight. Can you take a guess what disrupted them and almost wiped them off the face of the earth?
Well, and what year was this?
It would have been like 1861, I think. I think I'd
Yeah,
have.
I was just a baby at the time. I don't remember. I don't remember what was happening in 1861.
I was yes, I remember you. I remember you were cheating off my math homework. So the post office disrupted American Express with a money order.
Oh wow. Okay, that's interesting. Okay.
Right. And so I guess the other Pony Express companies failed. So what American Express was doing, not only were they taking your money, they also started saying, "Hey, we're in New York going to Boston. Do you want to take a ride with us? We'll pay you, and you're it's an armored car, it's not armored, but it's, we've got guards with guns to protect the money. You're going to be safe." So they were taking money and doing travel arrangements also. So when they
Wow.
started doing nationwide, they were doing travel arrangements, just as like like a new division they created, right? And so that's what I'm getting at here. Companies have these opportunities for these new divisions. When the post office disrupted them, American Express responded with their own money order. And I would
Right.
assume the other Pony Express companies just disappeared. You don't even know who they were.
Right.
So by
Yeah.
the 1890s, they were doing money orders and travel arrangements. They didn't do a credit card until 1959.
That
So
is, yeah,
it's a
the evolution of these companies, the
yeah,
ones that last, right? What
exactly.
we realize is that evolution is important for them to continue to exist.
Right. So they did financial services, travel service, like they were able to they transformed as opposed to folding, as opposed
Holding,
to just
yeah.
laying everyone off because we were disrupted. Okay, so we were disrupted. Disrupted. What do we do about that? And
Right.
they could, even though the money order came out, they could still do travel arrangements. They could still take you to New York and Boston and
Right.
California, all those things. So they still had their, I don't want to say horse and buggy, but pretty much. I mean,
You pretty much,
there were
yes.
no cars yet, right?
Yeah.
Um, American Express is a great example of it. So during this pandemic, and it would be interesting to see how many companies, instead of laying people off, said, well, it's going to cost us too much to lay them off and replace the jobs. So what are the other things we can do? Is there a new business unit we can create that
Right.
we've never done? And so the CEO I was speaking to, he was running this company 90s, early 2000s. He took 43 people, started an entirely new company. The company grew so big, he spun it off and they publicly trade on NASDAQ. And I think in 15 years, they had 100,000 employees.
Wow.
So so just training your people to do more good, better of the same thing that you've always done, you're going to lay them off. But if you think about how Navy SEALs are trained to handle resilience, and if you take on a new division to do something you haven't, your people are going to develop new skills and competencies. And maybe we can look at Apple. So you make these big computers, and then he says, well, put 1,000 songs on a little miniature device. How are we going to do that? We've never done it. So people had to learn to operate in a miniature computer. There are lots of new skills and competencies they learned. And then he said, okay, now turn that into a cell phone. And there are more new skills and competencies. So that makes Apple a much more valuable company, more innovative. Your people are more effective in the workplace. They're more resilient. And when
Right.
the economy went into a downturn, Apple seemed to, like it was nothing. But
Yeah.
I think Apple is losing that edge because they don't have someone driving that innovation now.
Well, it goes back to I watched one of your videos on leadership, right? And if a leader is supposed to be able to allow their team, right, to be able to drive innovation. And I think a lot of times, and what you were saying, but we see examples of it, that the visionary or the leader of the organization sometimes think that everything is supposed to come through them, and all they have to do is dictate and move the pieces
Right,
um,
right,
as they happen.
right.
But these examples that you're giving are a perfect example. Is if you have the right employees, that's the first thing, right? If you have the
Sure,
right
sure.
employees and you invest in them and you value them once you invest in them, because
Right.
a lot of these companies will train their employees, but how much do they value what they've already poured into them? And then trusting, right, that they can solve these problems, that they can take us to the next level, that they can come up with ideas that are going to drive innovation.
Right. So if you look at them as an asset, and if you look at any asset, how do I increase the value of this asset? So if you look at your employees as an asset, if just teaching them more about the company and more about technology, is that going to increase their value as an asset? So what other kind of training can we do that will have them? And so people talk about resilience. So it's not just the economy. I mean, we have wars happening in other countries. You have competitors that come, that disrupt your industry. And how do you become the disruptor instead of the disrupted? So, what kind of training do you need to have your people? Because for you to be a disruptor, your people are going to be disrupted. So if you think about Apple, put 1,000 songs on a device. Everyone's disrupted now. How are we going? No one's ever done it. There's no blueprint. So
Right.
why are you asking us to do something that's never been done? And why are we in this business of these miniature, we make these big, beautiful computers. You're smoking something, Steve.
But that's what created the opportunity by putting it to the team and having them figure it out instead
Right.
of being directed, instead of being told, this is what we're going to do.
Right.
And
Here's
which
the
is what you
problem.
said, leaders' jobs are not to solve problems, but to present the problems and to let their team figure it out.
Well, his job is to even invent and create problems.
Right. Which I thought was a very interesting perspective, because
Right.
it's through solving new problems is how you grow as a business, isn't it?
Exactly. And
Wow.
just so right, I have two thoughts, and I don't want to
Okay.
lose either one. Um, so if you train your people to be more resilient and be more effective in managing conflict and chaos and navigating, their communication skills will increase, right? Just
Right.
automatically, right?
Right.
Because
Right.
you now have to talk through complicated and chaos, and so you're going to galvanize teams. People are going to take those skills home and be more effective at managing conflict with their significant other, which that's why so many divorces happen. People they don't have great conflict resolution skills. They don't always have the great, most effective communication skills, and your relationship gets tested. So if you train people to be really effective in being able to themselves create problems and be able to solve them with their teams, they own those skills that they learned at work, and they're going to take them home, and they're now going to be more effective at home, and that the corporation could actually help significantly reduce the divorce rate by training people and having them put these skills to work to use in a practical way in the workplace, and then they go home with these with a completely different mindset in how they uh, choose their spouse. So and so the second part to that is,
Right.
um, what they found is that they looked at long term, marriages, and they looked at people who had these problems. They had a big problem that came up in the marriage, and the couples that stayed together and worked through that serious problem, 5 years later, they had a more intimate relationship. They were closer than ever. The couples
Right.
that said, "Hey, I'm out. See you later. I'm not dealing with this problem," they went, they remarried and divorced again because the same problem they had in the first marriage followed them to the second marriage.
Right.
So it's so important that people learn how to be able to navigate. How do you navigate chaos? How do you navigate when things are not going your way? There's a breakdown,
Right.
it's a disruption. So if you can have that skill at work, you'll be better with your children, you'll be better with your siblings and so forth.
Well, thank you, Ted. I would love for us to continue this conversation. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. But how would you sum up, if for folks in the audience who are listening, because the last pieces of how you put everything together is, I think, very important, that these skills that people acquire are like they don't just work in the workplace, right?
Right.
They work throughout a person's life, and corporations, right, can have an impact not just on products and services that they put out. They can impact just how society is interacting and dealing with each other, that this is just one big ecosystem. And so
Exactly.
as people are forming their businesses, what would you ask them to keep at the forefront of their minds, um, so that they can keep these things, they can stay focused on what you've just said, what you've just shared.
So it's the relationship that people have to problems that has to change. We're taught to want to get rid of problems and find a scapegoat and blame them, and then we think everything's okay. But it's our relationship with ourselves and problems. So if you are even in a small business, um, as you were saying, that if you're a small business owner, never be afraid to intentionally create problems. Never be afraid to ask your people to do something that's bigger than they are, because they will grow into those shoes and they will love you. They will thank you for it. They will. So even in your own personal life, don't be afraid to create a pair of shoes that you have to grow into, whether it's personally, professionally. It's sort of that go for. I don't want to be like Nike and say just do it, but
No.
it's there's a commitment that you have to it. It's not just this trial and error. It's a commitment. And what are the things that you're willing to do to train and prepare yourself to be able to fill those shoes that you never put on?
Thank you so much. Always a pleasure hearing your perspective. It's always a unique one. And so we look forward to, you may be a regular on our podcast. But thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm just here to create problems.
Thank you all for listening, and we'll be back again next week with another great guest. Take care.
The Business First podcast is hosted and produced by Sonia Aline. Executive producer Ken Johnson. Find the Business First podcast on Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Spotify, Odyssey, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, TuneIn, or wherever you get your podcast. On social media on IG at business_first_podcast. Follow the Mean Old Line Media Podcast Network on IG at Mean Old Line Media. Get the Mean Old Line Media app in the App Store or Google Play. The Business First podcast is a Mean Old Line Media production.